Black firefighter saves racist man. Later, he's shocked to learn the hero's identity. Flames leaped hungrily through the windows of the two-story house as James Miller stood frozen on his front lawn, his weathered face illuminated by the orange glow. The crackling roar of the fire nearly drowned out his desperate screams. "My wife! She's still in there! Margaret's still inside!" The 68-year-old man tried to rush back toward the inferno but collapsed to his knees, overcome by smoke inhalation and despair. His lungs burned from his first rescue attempt, and tears cut clean tracks down his soot-stained face. Fire trucks screeched to a halt along the curb, red lights painting the neighborhood in pulses of crimson. Firefighters rushed past James, their silhouettes dark against the blaze. "Second floor back bedroom," James choked out, grabbing at the passing firefighters. "Please, she takes sleeping pills. She might not even be awake." One firefighter stopped, placed a steadying hand on James's shoulder. Through the helmet's mask, James couldn't make out the man's features, just his eyes determined, focused. "Sir, we'll get her out. Stay here with the paramedics." Without waiting for a response, the firefighter charged toward the house, disappearing into the smoke and flames. James watched in horror as parts of the roof began to collapse. "No one's going to make it out of there," a neighbor whispered nearby. Long seconds stretched into unbearable minutes. The structural integrity of the house was failing. A terrible groaning sound filled the air as beams began to give way. Just as the fire chief was calling his men to retreat, a figure emerged from the billowing smoke, the firefighter, carrying Margaret's limp body in his arms. He staggered across the lawn, falling to his knees before the waiting paramedics. James rushed to his wife's side as oxygen was administered. Her eyes fluttered open and she coughed violently. "She's alive," a paramedic confirmed. James turned to thank the firefighter who had removed his helmet, revealing his face for the first time. The older man froze, his expression shifting from gratitude to something unreadable. The firefighter, a black man in his 30s with kind eyes, extended his hand. "Sir, are you all right?" James stared at the outstretched hand, his mouth working silently. But let's go back to how this all started. It was just 12 hours earlier when James Miller woke up on what seemed like an ordinary Thursday morning. James Miller opened his eyes at precisely 6:30 a.m., just as he had every day since retiring from the school district 7 years ago. He didn't need an alarm clock anymore. 40 years of teaching high school history had permanently set his internal clock. Margaret was still asleep beside him, her breathing soft and rhythmic. He carefully slid out of bed, not wanting to wake her. Their bedroom window faced east, and golden morning light spilled across the hardwood floor of their bedroom. The house on Maple Street had been their home for 35 years. They'd raised their daughter here, hosted countless neighborhood barbecues in the backyard, and planned to live out their retirement in these familiar rooms filled with memories. James padded downstairs in his slippers, the stairs creaking in all the familiar places. He started the coffee maker, a fancy digital one their daughter Melissa had bought them last Christmas, and unfolded the newspaper on the kitchen table. Real paper, not those digital versions everyone was reading these days. Some habits were worth preserving. The headline caught his eye: "New fire chief appointed. Department celebrates first African-American leader." There was a photo of a man in uniform shaking hands with the mayor. James scowled and flipped the page without reading the article. The kitchen radio played softly in the background, a Beatles song that reminded him of his college days. James hummed along as he prepared breakfast. 2 eggs over easy, wheat toast and bacon. Margaret would want her usual yogurt with granola when she woke up. As he cooked, James glanced at the calendar on the refrigerator door. Today was circled in red: Margaret's doctor appointment at 2:00 p.m. She'd been having those headaches again, and her memory seemed to be slipping more than usual for someone her age. Nothing to worry about, he told himself. Probably just needed a medication adjustment. The phone rang, pulling him from his thoughts. James wiped his hands on a dish towel and answered. "Hello, Dad, it's Melissa, just checking in before my flight." James smiled at the sound of his daughter's voice. "Hey there, sweetie, what time do you leave?" "Boarding in about an hour." "I should be in Chicago by noon, then the connecting flight gets me home to you guys by dinner time. How's Mom?" "Still sleeping. We've got that doctor appointment today, but otherwise everything's fine." There was a pause on the line. "Dad, promise me you'll really listen to what the doctor says this time. No dismissing things like you did at the last appointment." James felt a flicker of irritation. "I always listen to the doctor. I just don't think we need to worry until there's something to worry about." "Early intervention matters, Dad, especially with memory issues." "Your mother is fine," James said firmly. "She forgets things sometimes, so will you when you're our age." Melissa sighed. Just keep an open mind, okay? I'll see you tonight. Love you. Love you too, sweetheart. Safe travels. James hung up and returned to his breakfast, but his appetite had diminished. Kids always thought they knew better than their parents, even when the roles were supposed to be reversed. Melissa was pushing 40, but still treated him like he was the child sometimes. Upstairs, he heard Margaret stirring. A few minutes later, she appeared in the kitchen doorway, her silver hair tousled from sleep, wearing the blue robe he'd given her for their anniversary. "Morning, honey," she said, stifling a yawn. "Is that coffee I smell?" James rose to pour her a cup. "Just brewed. Melissa called. She'll be here for dinner." Margaret's face lit up. "Oh, wonderful. It's been too long since we've seen her." "What's the occasion?" James paused, cup in midair. "Honey, we talked about this yesterday. She's coming to stay for the week, remember? To help out after your appointment today." Confusion flickered across Margaret's face, then cleared. "Of course, silly me. I was half asleep when you mentioned it." James handed her the coffee, trying to ignore the knot of worry forming in his stomach. "How's your head this morning?" "Better," Margaret said, taking a sip. "Those new pills seem to be helping." They ate breakfast together, falling into the comfortable routine of a long marriage. Margaret talked about the book club meeting she had tomorrow, and James mentioned needing to fix the leaky faucet in the guest bathroom before Melissa arrived. "Oh, and Ellen called yesterday," Margaret said. "Their son just bought a house in that new development by the lake." James nodded. "Good for him, though I don't know why anyone would want to live out there. Too many changes in that neighborhood." Margaret gave him a look. "James, what? I'm just saying it's not the same place it was when we were looking for our first home." "Change isn't always bad," Margaret said gently. James grunted and returned to his newspaper. They'd had this conversation many times before. Margaret had always been the more progressive one, quick to embrace new ideas and people. James preferred things the way they'd always been: predictable, familiar, safe. After breakfast, James went out to the garden while Margaret got dressed. The vegetable patch had been his pride and joy since retirement, rows of tomatoes, peppers, and cucumbers stretching toward the sun. Gardening gave his hands something to do and his mind something to focus on besides worrying about Margaret. He was kneeling in the dirt, pulling weeds, when he heard his name called from next door. "Morning, Jim." James looked up to see his neighbor, Ray Winters, waving from across the fence. Ray and his wife Diane had moved in 5 years ago after the Hendersons retired to Florida. They were good neighbors, quiet, kept their property nice, brought in the Miller's mail when they visited Melissa in Boston. "Morning, Ray," James called back. "How are those tomato plants I gave you doing?" Ray walked over to the fence. "Growing like crazy. Diane's already planning what to do with all of them. Hey, did you hear about the commotion on Oak Street last night?" James stood, brushing dirt from his knees. "Oh, what happened?" "Some kind of domestic disturbance. Police cars, ambulance, the works. Apparently that new family that moved in, you know, the one with all the kids, husband got arrested." "Can't say I'm surprised," James muttered. "That whole street's gone downhill," Ray nodded. "Times are changing, that's for sure, not always for the better." He glanced at his watch. "Well, better get going. Got a tea time at 10. You should join us sometime, Jim." "Maybe," James said, though they both knew he wouldn't. James had never been one for golf, seemed like a waste of a perfectly good walk, as his father used to say. As Ray headed back to his house, James noticed a moving truck pulling up 2 doors down. The Peterson place. It had been on the market for months after old Bill Peterson passed away. James watched as a young couple got out of a car parked behind the truck. The woman was pregnant, her hand resting on her rounded belly as she surveyed the house. The man, James squinted, was black. He said something that made the woman laugh, then kissed her cheek before walking toward the moving truck. James frowned and turned back to his garden. The neighborhood really was changing. By noon, James had finished his yard work and showered. Margaret was in the kitchen preparing lunch, simple sandwiches and fruit. Her headache had returned, he could tell from the tightness around her eyes, but she insisted on doing things herself. "You should rest before the appointment," James said, taking the knife from her hand. "I can finish this," Margaret relented, sinking into a kitchen chair. "Maybe just for a minute. These spells come and go so quickly now." James fixed their sandwiches, trying not to show his concern. "Did you take your medication?" Margaret nodded. "An hour ago. It hasn't kicked in yet." She massaged her temples. "James, I'm scared about what the doctor might say today." He sat beside her, covering her hand with his. "Hey now, none of that. It's probably just stress, or maybe the medication needs adjusting. You've always been a worrier." "But what if it's something serious? What if it's, you know?" James squeezed her hand. "Then we'll face it together like we've faced everything for 43 years, but let's not borrow trouble." They ate lunch quietly, the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway marking the passing minutes. James kept the conversation light, reminiscing about the road trip they'd taken through New England last fall to see the changing leaves. Margaret smiled at the memories, the pain in her eyes gradually subsiding as the medication took effect. After lunch, James washed the dishes while Margaret went upstairs to rest before the appointment. As he dried the last plate, the doorbell rang. James opened the front door to find a young black man standing on his porch. He wore jeans and a polo shirt, and his smile was friendly. "Good afternoon, sir. I'm Michael Robinson. My wife Tanya and I just moved in down the street." James didn't return the smile. "What can I do for you?" If Michael noticed the coolness in James's tone, he didn't show it. "Just introducing myself to the neighbors. We're having a small housewarming cookout this Saturday afternoon and wanted to invite everyone on the block." He extended an envelope, which James reluctantly accepted. "That's the invitation with all the details," Michael continued. "Nothing fancy, just burgers and hot dogs, some drinks. We'd love to get to know everyone." "I'll have to check our schedule," James said stiffly. "Our daughter's visiting." "She's welcome too, of course, the more the merrier." James nodded curtly. "Is that all?" Michael's smile faltered slightly. "Yes, sir. Hope to see you Saturday." As the young man walked away, James closed the door perhaps a bit harder than necessary. He tossed the invitation onto the hall table without opening it. They wouldn't be going to any cookout. He had no interest in socializing with the new neighbors. Upstairs, he heard Margaret moving around, getting ready for the doctor's appointment. James pushed thoughts of the neighbors aside and went to check on his wife. The waiting room at Dr. Parker's office was half full when they arrived. James helped Margaret check in with the receptionist, then they found seats among the other patients, mostly older folks like themselves, a few younger people accompanying elderly parents. James picked up a dog-eared copy of National Geographic from the magazine rack. Margaret sat beside him, hands folded in her lap, her foot tapping nervously against the linoleum floor. "It's going to be fine," James whispered, reaching over to still her foot with his hand. Margaret gave him a weak smile. "I know. I just hate doctors' offices." After 20 minutes, a nurse called Margaret's name. James set down his magazine and stood to accompany her. "Actually, Mr. Miller," the nurse said, "Dr. Parker would like to speak with Mrs. Miller alone first, then call you in after the initial examination." James frowned. "That's not how it usually works." Margaret touched his arm. "It's okay, James. I'm not a child. I'll be fine." Reluctantly, James sat back down, watching as his wife followed the nurse through the door that led to the examination rooms. It bothered him being excluded like this. He and Margaret didn't keep secrets from each other. Whatever the doctor had to say, they should hear it together. The minutes crawled by. James tried to focus on the magazine, but the words blurred before his eyes. Around him, other patients were called in, examined, and left. Eventually, he was the only one remaining in the waiting room. Finally, after what seemed like hours but was actually 45 minutes, the nurse reappeared. "Mr. Miller, Dr. Parker would like to see you now." James followed her down a hallway to Dr. Parker's office. Not an examination room, he noted with growing apprehension. Margaret sat in one of two chairs facing the doctor's desk. She didn't look up when James entered. Dr. Parker, a woman in her 50s with prematurely gray hair and kind eyes, stood to greet him. "Mr. Miller, thank you for your patience. Please have a seat." James sat beside Margaret and reached for her hand. Her fingers were cold. "What's going on?" he demanded, looking from his wife to the doctor. "Why all the secrecy?" Dr. Parker folded her hands on her desk. "Mr. Miller, I've been discussing some test results with your wife. The MRI we did last week showed some concerning changes in her brain function." James felt his throat tight. "What kind of changes?" "There are indications of early-stage Alzheimer's disease." The words hit James like a physical blow. He'd feared this diagnosis for months, but had pushed the possibility away, dismissed Margaret's memory lapses as normal aging, attributed her confusion to stress or poor sleep. That's not possible," he stammered. "She's only 67, she's too young." "Early onset Alzheimer's can begin in the 50s or 60s, Dr. Parker explained gently. "The symptoms Margaret has been experiencing, memory loss, confusion, headaches, are consistent with the early stages of the disease." James shook his head. "There must be some mistake. Run the tests again." "James," Margaret said softly, finally looking at him. Her eyes were red-rimmed but dry. "I've been noticing things for a while now, things I didn't tell you about because I didn't want to worry you, names I couldn't remember, places I got lost going to. The time I put my keys in the refrigerator and couldn't find them for hours." "That happens to everyone," James insisted. Dr. Parker leaned forward. "Mr. Miller, I understand this is difficult news, but the earlier we begin treatment, the better we can manage the symptoms and potentially slow the progression." "What kind of treatment?" James asked, his voice hollow. The doctor outlined a plan involving medication, cognitive exercises, lifestyle changes, and regular monitoring. She mentioned support groups for both patients and caregivers, handed them brochures about the disease and resources for families. James barely heard any of it. His mind was stuck on a single thought. Margaret was sick, really sick, and there was nothing he could do to fix it. "I'd like to schedule a follow-up appointment in 2 weeks," Dr. Parker was saying. "And I strongly recommend you both attend the support group that meets here at the hospital every Thursday evening. It can be incredibly helpful to connect with others going through similar experiences." Margaret nodded. "We'll be there." James said nothing. He felt numb, disconnected from the conversation happening around him. This couldn't be happening, not to Margaret, not to them. The drive home was silent. Margaret stared out the passenger window, occasionally wiping away tears. James gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He wanted to say something comforting, but words failed him. What could he possibly say that would make this better? As they pulled into their driveway, Margaret finally spoke. "James, we need to talk about what happens next." "Not now," he said, turning off the engine. "Melissa will be here soon. We'll figure it all out later." "No," Margaret said firmly. "We need to talk now before Melissa arrives. I don't want to tell her tonight. Let me have one normal evening with my daughter before everything changes." James sighed. "All right, let's go inside." In the living room, they sat on the sofa where they'd spent countless evenings watching TV, reading, simply being together. The familiar setting felt wrong somehow, as if the diagnosis had already changed their home, tainted it with the shadow of what was to come. "I want to stay independent as long as possible," Margaret began. "Dr. Parker said the medication might help for a while, and I want to try the support group." James nodded mechanically. "But we need to be realistic," she continued. "This is going to get worse. I'm going to get worse. There may come a time when you can't take care of me on your own." "I'll always take care of you," James said fiercely. "Always." Margaret took his hand. "I know you will, but there might be a point when the best way to take care of me is to get help. Promise me you'll recognize when that time comes." James felt tears burning behind his eyes. "I promise," he whispered. They sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of the future pressing down on them. "I should start dinner," Margaret said eventually. "Melissa will be here by 6. James checked his watch. 4:30 p.m. "I'll help you." In the kitchen, they moved around each other in the dance of long companionship, preparing Melissa's favorite meal, lasagna with garlic bread and Caesar salad. They didn't talk about the diagnosis again, as if by unspoken agreement, they'd set it aside until after their daughter's visit. At 5:45 p.m., James went upstairs to change his shirt. As he buttoned a fresh flannel, he caught sight of himself in the mirror, an old man with fear in his eyes. He hardly recognized himself. "Pull it together," he muttered to his reflection. "For Margaret, for Melissa." The doorbell rang just after 6. James heard Margaret's delighted greeting, Melissa's voice, warm and excited. He took a deep breath and went downstairs to join them. Melissa stood in the entryway, her suitcase beside her, hugging her mother tightly. At 38, she was the perfect blend of both her parents' Margaret's gentle eyes and James's determined chin. Her dark hair was shorter than the last time they'd seen her, cut in a stylish bob that framed her face. When she saw James, she released Margaret and moved to embrace him. "Dad, you look good." James hugged his daughter, inhaling the familiar scent of her shampoo. "So do you, sweetheart. How was the flight?" "Uneventful, which is exactly how I like my flights to be," Melissa laughed. "Something smells amazing. Is that lasagna?" "Your favorite," Margaret said. "It'll be ready in about 20 minutes. Melissa picked up her suitcase. "Perfect. Let me just take this upstairs and freshen up." Once she was out of earshot, James turned to Margaret. "You okay?" Margaret nodded. "I'm fine. Let's just have a nice evening with our daughter." Dinner was a success. They kept the conversation light. Melissa's job at the marketing firm in Boston, her boyfriend Stephen, who was getting serious, neighborhood gossip and plans for the week ahead. If Melissa noticed the occasional shadow that crossed her mother's face or the way James sometimes stared into space, she didn't mention it. After dessert, Margaret's famous apple pie, they moved to the living room for coffee. James was just about to suggest watching a movie when Melissa cleared her throat. "So," she said, setting down her coffee cup. "How did the appointment go today?" James and Margaret exchanged glances. "We were going to talk about that tomorrow," Margaret said quietly. Melissa looked from one parent to the other. "That doesn't sound good. What did the doctor say?" Margaret sighed. "It's Alzheimer's, honey, early stages." Melissa's face crumpled. "Oh, Mom." "It's not the end of the world," Margaret said, reaching for her daughter's hand. "We caught it early. There are treatments, support groups. We're going to be fine." "We?" Melissa turned to James. Dad, are you okay? James nodded stiffly. I'm fine. Your mother's the one who's sick. James, Margaret admonished gently. Well, it's true, he said, his voice rising slightly. Everyone's asking if I'm okay. I'm not the one with the diagnosis. Melissa studied her father's face. You know this affects both of you. You'll be her caregiver. I'm her husband, James corrected. For better or worse, remember. I didn't mean, I know what you meant, James interrupted. Everyone thinks I can't handle this. The doctor, your mother, now you. I've taken care of this family for 40 years. I'm not going to fall apart now. Dad, no one is saying you can't handle it, Melissa said carefully. But this is a lot for anyone to process. It's okay to be upset, to be scared. James stood abruptly. I need some air. Without waiting for a response, he strode to the front door and stepped outside onto the porch. The evening air was cool against his flushed face. He sat heavily in one of the wicker chairs, his hands shaking. Alzheimer's. The word echoed in his mind, terrible and final. He'd watched his own mother waste away from the disease 20 years ago, the confusion, the fear, the gradual loss of self. The thought of vibrant, intelligent Margaret suffering the same fate was unbearable. The front door opened and Melissa stepped out. She sat in the chair beside him, not speaking. After a long moment, James broke the silence. I'm sorry for snapping. It's okay, Dad, you're allowed to be upset. I don't know what to do, he admitted, his voice breaking. I can't fix this. Melissa reached over and took his hand. No one can fix this, but you don't have to handle it alone. That's why I'm here. That's why there are support groups and resources and people who care about you both. James nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. I'm scared, Melissa. I know, Dad, me too. They sat together in the growing darkness, father and daughter, sharing the weight of their fear for the woman they both loved. Inside, Margaret wiped away tears as she cleared the dinner dishes. She hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but the window above the sink was open, and voices carried in the quiet evening. James rarely showed vulnerability, especially to their daughter. Hearing him admit his fear broke her heart and strengthened her resolve. She would face this disease with as much grace and courage as she could muster for James, for Melissa, and for herself. Later that night, after Melissa had gone to bed, James and Margaret prepared for sleep in the quiet intimacy of their bedroom. Margaret took her medications while James turned down the covers. They moved around each other with the easy familiarity of decades together, each anticipating the other's needs and habits. As they lay side by side in the darkness, Margaret reached for James's hand. We're going to be okay, she whispered. James squeezed her fingers. Yes, we are. It was a promise he intended to keep no matter what. The next few days fell into a new pattern. Melissa worked remotely from the guest room, taking breaks to help around the house or accompany Margaret on errands. James puttered in his garden, researched Alzheimer's treatments online, and tried to maintain a sense of normalcy. On Saturday morning, James was weeding the front flower beds when a moving van pulled up in front of the new neighbor's house. He watched as men unloaded furniture, a sectional sofa, a dining table, bedroom sets. The pregnant woman, Tanya, he remembered directed traffic from the front porch, pointing where each piece should go. Her husband, Michael, emerged from the house carrying a box of tools. He spotted James and waved, then said something to his wife before walking across the lawn toward the Miller's house. James straightened, brushing dirt from his hands. Morning, Mr. Miller, Michael called. Beautiful day for gardening. James nodded curtly. Morning. Just wanted to check if you and Mrs. Miller received our invitation for the cookout this afternoon. We did, James said, but I'm afraid we can't make it. Family matters. Michael's smile dimmed slightly. I understand. Family comes first, maybe another time. Before James could respond, the front door opened and Melissa stepped out onto the porch. Dad, Mom's looking for this. She stopped, noticing Michael. Oh, hello. Michael turned, his friendly smile returning. Hello, I'm Michael Robinson. My wife and I just moved in down the street. Melissa came down the steps, extending her hand. Melissa Miller, James is my dad. I'm visiting from Boston. They shook hands. James watched the exchange with growing irritation. We're having a housewarming cookout this afternoon, Michael told Melissa. Your dad says you have family matters to attend to, but you're all welcome if your plans change. A cookout? Melissa glanced at her father, then back to Michael. That sounds nice. What time? Starting around 2, nothing fancy, just burgers and drinks, meeting the neighbors. We'll think about it, Melissa said. Thanks for the invitation. Michael nodded. Hope to see you there. Nice meeting you, Melissa, Mr. Miller. As he walked back to his own house, Melissa turned to James with raised eyebrows. He seems nice. Why didn't you mention a cookout? James resumed his weeding. Because we're not going. Why not? It might be good for Mom to get out, socialize a bit. The doctor said maintaining social connections is important. We have plans, James said firmly. Melissa crossed her arms. What plans? We were just going to watch that movie Mom's been wanting to see. Melissa, I don't want to argue about this. I'm not arguing, Dad. I'm asking a simple question. Why don't you want to go to the neighbor's cookout? James straightened again, fixing his daughter with a hard stare. Because I don't want to spend my Saturday afternoon making small talk with strangers who have nothing in common with us. Melissa's eyes narrowed. Nothing in common? You mean because they're black? I didn't say that. You didn't have to. Melissa shook her head in disappointment. I thought you'd moved past this, Dad. It's 2025, not 1965. Don't lecture me about what year it is, James snapped. I'm not some racist old man if that's what you're implying. I just don't see the point in pretending we're all going to be best friends with people who moved here from God knows where, bringing their different values and ways of living. Different values? You don't know anything about them. I know they're not like us. Melissa threw up her hands. Unbelievable. You know what, Dad? This is exactly the kind of thinking that, what's going on out here? Margaret stood on the porch, looking concerned. She'd been napping when Melissa went outside, and the raised voices had apparently woken her. Melissa sighed. Nothing, Mom, just a difference of opinion. Margaret came down the steps slowly, still moving carefully after her rest. About what? The new neighbors invited us to a cookout this afternoon, Melissa explained. I think it might be nice to go. Dad disagrees. Margaret looked at James. Is this about the Robinsons, the couple that moved into the Peterson place? James nodded reluctantly. They seem lovely, Margaret said. The wife, Tanya, came over yesterday while you were at the hardware store. She brought a plate of cookies. She's a kindergarten teacher, and he's a firefighter at the station downtown. A firefighter, Melissa perked up. See, Dad, he serves the community. How bad could they be? James scowled. I never said they were bad people. I just don't want to go to their cookout. Margaret touched his arm gently. James, I'd like to go just for a little while. It would be nice to meet the other neighbors, get some fresh air. James looked at his wife's hopeful expression and felt his resolve weakening. Since the diagnosis, he'd been trying to give her whatever she wanted to make her happy in the time they had left before the disease progressed. Fine, he conceded. We'll make an appearance, but we're not staying long. Margaret smiled and kissed his cheek. Thank you, dear. I'll go get ready. As she headed back inside, Melissa lingered, watching her father with a mixture of disappointment and concern. What? James demanded. Nothing, Melissa said. I just hope you'll give these people a chance, for Mom's sake, if nothing else. She followed Margaret into the house, leaving James alone with his gardening tools and his wounded pride. At 2:30, the Miller family walked down the street to the Robinsons' house. Several neighbors were already there, gathered in the backyard where Michael was grilling burgers. Tanya, wearing a sundress that accentuated her pregnant belly, greeted them warmly. Mrs. Miller, I'm so glad you could make it. She embraced Margaret like an old friend. And you must be Melissa. Michael mentioned meeting you this morning. Nice to meet you, Melissa said, handing over a bottle of wine they'd brought. Congratulations on the new house and the baby. Tanya beamed, resting a hand on her stomach. Thank you, we're due in just 6 weeks. We wanted to get settled in the new place before the little one arrives. She turned to James, her smile unwavering despite his obvious discomfort. Mr. Miller, welcome. Michael's at the grill if you'd like a burger. There are drinks in the cooler on the patio. James nodded stiffly. Thank you. Tanya led them through the house, the layout identical to the Miller's own home, but with modern furnishings and fresh paint, to the backyard where about 20 people mingled in small groups. James recognized most of the neighbors. The Winters from next door, the Patels from across the street, the Johnsons from the corner house, and several others whose names escaped him at the moment. Michael spotted them and waved from the grill. Glad you could make it. Burgers will be ready in a few minutes. Margaret guided James to where Ray and Diane Winters were standing near a table of appetizers. Melissa drifted toward a group of younger neighbors, leaving her parents to make conversation with people their own age. Jim, Margaret, Ray greeted them. Didn't expect to see you here. Melissa convinced us to come, James said, not meeting his neighbor's eyes. Diane offered Margaret a paper plate. These stuffed mushrooms are delicious. Try one. As the women chatted about recipes, Ray leaned closer to James. So what do you make of the new folks? James shrugged. Seem nice enough. Firefighter, Ray said, nodding toward Michael. Dangerous job. So I hear. Ray took a sip of his beer. Neighborhood's really changing. First the Patels, now the Robinsons. Next thing you know, the whole block will be different. James grunted in agreement. It was a relief to know he wasn't the only one who felt this way, who noticed how things were shifting around them. The world he'd grown up in, the world he'd raised Melissa in, was disappearing, replaced by something unfamiliar and unsettling. Across the yard, Michael had finished grilling the first batch of burgers. He called out for everyone to help themselves. As people lined up at the food table, James hung back, watching. Margaret was deep in conversation with Mrs. Patel, and Melissa seemed to be hitting it off with a young couple he didn't recognize. "Not hungry?" a voice asked from beside him. James turned to find Michael standing there, a plate in each hand. He offered one to James. "Thought I'd save you waiting in line. Hope you like it medium well." Reluctantly, James accepted the plate. "Thanks. My pleasure." Michael didn't move away as James had hoped. Instead, he gestured to a pair of empty chairs nearby. "Mind if we sit for a minute? My feet are killing me after moving furniture all morning." James couldn't think of a polite way to refuse. They sat, and James took a bite of the burger to avoid having to make conversation. It was good, perfectly cooked, seasoned just right. "How long have you lived in the neighborhood, Mr. Miller?" Michael asked after a moment. 35 years, James replied. "Bought the house when our daughter was 3. Michael nodded. "It's a great area, good schools, safe streets. That's why we chose it for our family." "Where did you live before?" James asked, curiosity getting the better of him. "Downtown apartment." Fine for a young couple, but not ideal for raising kids. We'd been saving for a house for years. When Tanya got pregnant, we knew it was time to make the move. James nodded, taking another bite of his burger. "Your wife mentioned you're retired," Michael continued. "What did you do before, if you don't mind my asking?" "Taught high school history for 40 years, over at Lincoln High." Michael's face lit up. "No kidding, my mom was a teacher, English at Roosevelt High. She always said teaching was the hardest job she ever loved." Despite himself, James felt a flicker of connection. "Your mother got that right. Most days I wanted to pull my hair out, but I wouldn't have traded it for anything." They fell into a surprisingly easy conversation about education, the challenges of teaching teenagers, the changes in the school system over the decades. James found himself relaxing slightly as they talked. Michael was articulate and thoughtful, with intelligent opinions about topics James cared about. Their conversation was interrupted when Tanya approached, her hand supporting her lower back. "Sorry to interrupt, gentlemen, but Michael, your mother's on the phone. She wants to know if we need her to bring anything when she visits next weekend." Michael stood. "I'll take it inside. Excuse me, Mr. Miller." As he walked away, Tanya took his seat. "I hope my husband wasn't boring you with shop talk." Once he gets going about the fire department, he can talk for hours. "We were actually discussing education," James said. "He mentioned his mother was a teacher." Tanya smiled. "Yes, she's retired now but still substitutes occasionally. Teaching runs in his family. His grandfather was one of the first black principals in this city back in the 60s, faced a lot of resistance but never gave up." James shifted uncomfortably. He'd been teaching during those years of integration, had seen firsthand the struggles and tensions. Had he been part of the resistance? He couldn't honestly say he hadn't been. "Your husband seems dedicated to his work," he said, changing the subject. "He is," Tanya agreed, her expression softening with pride. "He always wanted to be a firefighter ever since he was a little boy. Says there's no better feeling than helping people on what might be the worst day of their lives." Before James could respond, they were joined by Margaret and Melissa, both looking flushed and happy from socializing. "There you are," Margaret said, resting a hand on James's shoulder. "Are you having a nice chat?" "Yes," James said, surprising himself with his sincerity. "Just getting to know the neighbors." Tanya beamed. "I should check on the other guests. Please help yourselves to more food, desserts. We're so glad you could come." As she walked away, Melissa gave her father an approving look. "See. That wasn't so bad, was it?" James shrugged. "They seem like good people." It was a small concession, but both his wife and daughter appeared pleased by it. They spent another hour at the cookout, James gradually relaxing enough to talk with other neighbors, even laugh at Ray's jokes about retirement and getting older. By the time they said their goodbyes and walked back home, the sun was setting. Margaret was tired but happy, her cheeks flushed from the social activity. "That was lovely," she said as they entered their house. "The Robinsons are going to be wonderful neighbors." James made a noncommittal sound. Michael Robinson seemed decent enough, but one conversation didn't change a lifetime of beliefs and attitudes. Still, for Margaret's sake, he was glad they'd gone. "I'm going to lie down for a bit before dinner," Margaret announced, heading for the stairs. "That was more excitement than I'm used to these days." Melissa went to the kitchen to start preparing the evening meal, leaving James alone in the living room. He sank into his armchair, feeling the weight of the day, the socializing, the forced pleasantries, the unexpected moments of genuine connection. Perhaps the neighborhood was changing. Perhaps he was too set in his ways, too resistant to the inevitable march of time. But change wasn't easy, especially not at his age, especially not with Margaret's diagnosis hanging over them like a storm cloud. He closed his eyes, suddenly exhausted. Just a quick rest before dinner, he told himself. Just 5 minutes, James awoke to the smell of smoke. Disoriented, he blinked in the darkness. How long had he been asleep? The living room was filled with a hazy gray cloud, and the acrid scent burned his nostrils. "Margaret," he called, pushing himself out of the chair. "Melissa," no answer. The smoke was thicker near the kitchen. James moved toward it, covering his mouth and nose with his sleeve. "Melissa," he called again, his voice hoarse. "Are you in here?" The kitchen was empty, but smoke poured from the oven. James rushed to turn it off and yanked open the door. A sheet pan of something chicken had been left cooking too long and was now charred beyond recognition. But this small fire didn't explain the amount of smoke filling the house. James closed the oven and turned, searching for the source. That's when he saw the flames licking up the wall near the back door. A dish towel had caught fire, perhaps left too close to the stove, and the flames had spread to the curtains and the wooden cabinets. "Fire!" James shouted, suddenly fully awake. "Margaret, Melissa, fire!" He grabbed the fire extinguisher from under the sink and aimed it at the base of the flames, but the fire had already spread too far, crawling up the walls and across the ceiling with terrifying speed. The heat drove him back into the hallway. "Margaret!" he screamed, heading for the stairs. "Melissa!" Melissa appeared at the top of the stairs, her eyes wide with fear. "Dad, what's happening?" "Fire in the kitchen!" James coughed as smoke filled his lungs. "Where's your mother?" "Still napping, I think. I was in the shower, I didn't hear." "Get out," James ordered. "Call 911, I'll get your mother." Melissa hesitated for just a moment, then ran down the stairs and passed him toward the front door. James took the stairs two at a time, his aging knees protesting the strain. The smoke was less dense on the second floor, but he could hear the crackling roar of the fire growing louder. "Margaret," he called, pushing open their bedroom door. She was still lying on the bed, seemingly asleep despite the commotion. The sleeping pills, James realized with a jolt of fear. She'd taken one before lying down. "Margaret, wake up!" He shook her shoulder roughly. "The house is on fire. We need to get out." Margaret's eyes fluttered open, unfocused and confused. "James, what's wrong?" "Fire, Margaret. We need to go now." He helped her sit up, then pulled her to her feet. She swayed unsteadily, still groggy from the medication. "I don't understand," she mumbled. "No time to explain. Can you walk?" She nodded vaguely. James put his arm around her waist and guided her toward the door. In the hallway, the smoke was getting thicker, billowing up the stairs from the first floor. "Cover your mouth," James instructed, pulling the neck of his shirt up over his nose. Margaret did the same with the sleeve of her blouse. They made it to the top of the stairs, but the scene below stopped them cold. The entire first floor was engulfed in flames. The fire had spread from the kitchen to the living room and was now blocking the front door. There was no way down. "Back," James coughed, pulling Margaret away from the stairs. "We need another way out." They retreated to the bedroom. James slammed the door shut and shoved a towel along the bottom crack to keep out the smoke. He went to the window and looked down at the front yard. Melissa stood on the lawn, talking frantically into her phone. Neighbors were gathering, pointing up at the house. James pushed the window open and called down. "Melissa, we're trapped. The stairs are blocked." Melissa looked up, her face pale with fear. "The fire department is on the way. Just hang on." In the distance, James could hear sirens, but the fire was moving fast. Smoke seeped under the door despite the towel, and he could feel the heat intensifying. "We need to get air," he told Margaret, who was sitting on the edge of the bed, coughing violently. He helped her to the window, where she gulped in the clean night air. "I'm scared, James," she whispered. "I know, sweetheart, help is coming. We just need to hang on." The sirens grew louder, and soon fire trucks pulled up in front of the house. Firefighters jumped out, unrolling hoses, shouting orders. James waved frantically from the window. "Up here, second floor." One of the firefighters spotted them and pointed. Others rushed to set up a ladder against the side of the house. The bedroom door was hot to the touch now. James could hear the fire just outside, the hungry roar of flames consuming everything in their path. Smoke filled the room despite the open window, making it harder to breathe with each passing second. Margaret's coughing grew worse. She slumped against him, her eyes fluttering. "Stay with me," James pleaded, patting her cheek. "The firefighters are coming, just stay awake." A face appeared at the window, a firefighter in full gear, helmet, and mask. "Sir, ma'am, I'm going to help you out. Is anyone else in the house?" "No," James coughed. "Just us. My wife, she's not doing well." The firefighter climbed through the window. "I'll take her first, then come back for you." "No," James shook his head. "Take us both. I won't leave her." "Sir, the ladder can only safely—" "I'm not leaving her," James insisted, his voice breaking on a cough. The firefighter assessed the situation quickly. "All right, can you carry her to the window?" James nodded and gathered Margaret in his arms. She was so light, so fragile. Her head lolled against his shoulder as he struggled toward the window. The firefighter helped position Margaret on his back, securing her arms around his neck. "Hold tight, ma'am. I've got you." To James, he said, "Follow me down, take it slow, one rung at a time. I'll be right below you." James watched as the firefighter began the descent, carrying Margaret piggyback style down the ladder. He followed, his lungs burning, his eyes watering from the smoke, his hands shaking with fear and adrenaline. The ladder seemed to stretch forever. James focused on the rungs before him, on placing one foot after another, on not looking down at the gathering crowd below. All that mattered was getting Margaret to safety. Halfway down, a tremendous crash came from inside the house. James looked up to see the bedroom window blown out by a surge of flames, if they'd been inside even a minute longer. "Keep moving, sir," the firefighter called up. "Almost there." James continued his slow descent. When they finally reached the ground, paramedics rushed forward with oxygen masks. The firefighter gently transferred Margaret to a stretcher while another paramedic led James to the ambulance. "Margaret," James gasped. "Is she? We're taking care of her," the paramedic assured him, fitting an oxygen mask over his face. "Just breathe." James sank onto the edge of the ambulance, his legs finally giving out. Through the chaos of emergency vehicles, flashing lights, and shouting voices, he saw Melissa running toward him. "Dad," she threw her arms around him, sobbing. "I thought I was so scared. I'm okay," he wheezed, pulling the mask aside briefly. "Your mother, they're helping her." Melissa looked over her shoulder at the other ambulance where paramedics worked on Margaret. "They said she inhaled a lot of smoke." James struggled to his feet. "I need to be with her." The paramedic gently pushed him back down. "Sir, you need to stay here. Let us check you out first." But James wouldn't be deterred. With Melissa's help, he made his way to the other ambulance. Margaret lay on a stretcher, an oxygen mask over her face, an IV in her arm. Her eyes were closed. "Margaret," James croaked, reaching for her hand. A paramedic looked up. "Are you her husband?" James nodded. "She's stable, but we need to get her to the hospital. The smoke inhalation is serious and her oxygen levels are low." "I'm going with her," James said. It wasn't a request. The paramedic nodded. "All right, but you need oxygen too." James climbed into the ambulance, never letting go of Margaret's hand. Melissa stood outside, tears streaming down her face. "I'll follow in my car," she called as they prepared to close the doors. As the ambulance pulled away, James looked back at their home of 35 years, now engulfed in flames. Firefighters battled the blaze, but it was clear the house was already lost. Everything they owned, photo albums, Margaret's piano, his books, Melissa's childhood toys saved in the attic, all gone. But Margaret was alive. That was all that mattered. At the hospital, they were separated for examination. James fought to stay with Margaret, but the doctors insisted they both needed treatment. While a young ER doctor checked him over, James couldn't stop asking about his wife. "She's in good hands," the doctor assured him, listening to his lungs. "Your oxygen levels are improving, but we'll want to keep you overnight for observation." "I need to see my wife," James insisted. "As soon as you're both stabilized," the doctor promised. "Your daughter is here. She's with your wife now." James reluctantly submitted to the examination, the oxygen mask, the various monitors they attached to him. His body ached from the ordeal, but his mind was fixed on one thought: Margaret. After what seemed like hours but was probably only 45 minutes, Melissa appeared at his bedside. "How is she?" James demanded, pulling the oxygen mask aside. "Stable," Melissa said, her face drawn with exhaustion and worry. "They're keeping her sedated for now. The doctor says the smoke inhalation was severe, but she should recover." James closed his eyes in relief. "Thank God. They want to keep both of you at least overnight," Melissa continued. "I called Aunt Susan. She said we can stay with her until we figure things out." The reality of their situation began to sink in. Their home was gone, all their possessions destroyed, and with Margaret's diagnosis. "One thing at a time," James murmured, more to himself than to Melissa. "We'll take it one day at a time." Melissa squeezed his hand. "Get some rest, Dad. I'll be right here." James didn't think he could sleep, but exhaustion overtook him. He drifted off, still wearing the oxygen mask, still hearing the phantom roar of flames in his ears. He woke to sunlight streaming through hospital blinds. For a moment he was disoriented, unsure where he was or why. Then the memories of the fire came rushing back. "Margaret," he gasped, sitting up too quickly. His head spun and he grabbed the bed rail to steady himself. "Easy, Mr. Miller," a nurse said, appearing at his side. "You're still recovering." "My wife," James insisted. "Need to see her. She's right next door," the nurse said soothingly. "Your daughter is with her. The doctor will be in shortly to check on you both." James sank back against the pillows, his heart racing. "Is my wife awake? Is she okay?" "She's stable," the nurse said, checking his IV. "The doctor can give you more details." It was another agonizing hour before the doctor arrived, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a tired smile. "Mr. Miller, I'm Dr. Reed. I've been overseeing your wife's care." Your own condition has improved significantly overnight. Your oxygen levels are good and your lungs are clearing well. And my wife, Dr. Reed's expression grew more serious. Mrs. Miller's condition is stable but more concerning. The smoke inhalation was severe, and with her pre-existing condition, your daughter mentioned early-stage Alzheimer's. We're being especially cautious. We'd like to keep her for another day or two for observation. Can I see her? Of course. In fact, I think it would be good for her. She's been asking for you. With the doctor's help, James got out of bed. His legs were shaky and his chest still hurt when he breathed deeply, but he was determined to see Margaret. Dr. Reed led him to the next room where Margaret lay in a hospital bed, looking pale and fragile against the white sheets. Melissa sat beside her, holding her hand. When Margaret saw James, her face lit up despite her obvious exhaustion. "James, you're okay." He moved to her side and took her other hand, careful not to disturb the IV. "I'm fine. How are you feeling?" "Tired. My throat hurts." Her voice was raspy from the smoke and the intubation they'd performed during the night. "The house." James exchanged glances with Melissa. "Don't worry about that now, just focus on getting better." But Margaret persisted. "James, tell me," he sighed. "It's gone, sweetheart. The fire spread too quickly." By the time the firefighters got it under control, there wasn't much left to save. Margaret closed her eyes, tears seeping from beneath her lids. "All our memories, our pictures." "We have the digital ones," Melissa said quickly. "Everything I scanned last year for your anniversary album, and the important things aren't in things, Mom, they're here." She placed a hand over her heart. Margaret nodded, but the loss was etched on her face. 43 years of marriage, 35 years in that house, all reduced to ashes in a single night. "What happened?" she asked after a moment. "How did it start?" James looked to Melissa, who shook her head slightly. She didn't know either. "The fire marshal is investigating," James said, "but I think it might have been something in the kitchen. There was food burning in the oven when I woke up." Melissa's eyes widened. "Oh God, that was my fault. I put chicken in to bake, then went up to shower. I must have fallen asleep afterward. I completely forgot about it." "It's not your fault," James said firmly. "It was an accident. The important thing is we all got out." "Thanks to the firefighters," Margaret said. "They saved us." James nodded, remembering the firefighter who'd carried Margaret down the ladder. He hadn't even seen the man's face behind the mask, hadn't thought to ask his name in the chaos that followed. "We'll need to thank them," he said, "when you're better." Doctor had been standing quietly by the door, allowing them this moment together. Now she stepped forward. "Mrs. Miller needs her rest, and so do you, Mr. Miller. I'd like to run a few more tests this afternoon, and if all looks good, we can discuss discharging you tomorrow." James reluctantly agreed to return to his own room. Before leaving, he leaned down to kiss Margaret's forehead. "I'll be right next door," he promised. "Melissa will stay with you." Margaret squeezed his hand. "I love you, James." "I love you too, more than anything." Back in his room, James sat on the edge of his bed, staring out the window at the bright summer day. How could the world look so normal when everything had changed? Their home was gone. Margaret was sick, both from the smoke and from the disease slowly taking her mind. They would have to start over, find a new place to live, replace everything they'd lost. And for what? A few more good years before the Alzheimer's progressed. The unfairness of it all hit him like a physical blow. James buried his face in his hands, allowing himself, just for a moment, to feel the full weight of their loss. A knock at the door made him look up. A nurse stood there, accompanied by a man in street clothes, jeans, and a polo shirt. Something about him seemed familiar. "Mr. Miller, there's someone here to see you." The man stepped forward, and James recognized him immediately. Michael Robinson, the new neighbor, the firefighter. "Mr. Miller," Michael said, his expression concerned. "I hope I'm not intruding. I wanted to check on you and Mrs. Miller, see how you're doing." James stared at him, confused. "You knew about the fire?" Michael looked uncomfortable. "Sir, I was there. I'm a firefighter at Station 12. We responded to the call last night." Understanding dawned slowly. You were the one who carried Margaret down the ladder." Michael nodded. "Yes, sir." "I didn't realize it was you and your wife until after we got you both safely down. By then, you were already in the ambulance." James felt a surge of emotion, gratitude, shame, confusion. This man, this neighbor he'd been so reluctant to welcome, had saved their lives. I don't know what to say," James stammered. "Thank you seems inadequate." Michael moved closer, pulling up a chair beside the bed. "No thanks necessary, it's my job. How is Mrs. Miller doing?" "She's stable. They're keeping her another day or two for observation." James hesitated, then asked, "Do they know what caused the fire?" "The preliminary investigation suggests it started in the kitchen, an electrical issue with the oven. These older homes sometimes have wiring problems that go undetected for years." So it hadn't been Melissa's forgotten dinner after all. Small comfort, but James was glad his daughter wouldn't have to carry that guilt. "The house," Michael's expression was grim. I'm sorry, Mr. Miller. There's not much left. The structure was too compromised to save. James nodded, having expected as much. We'll rebuild or find somewhere else. If there's anything Tanya and I can do to help, you've done enough, James interrupted, then realizing how that sounded, added, more than enough, you saved our lives. Michael smiled slightly. Like I said, it's my job, but I'm glad it was your family I was able to help. He stood. I should let you rest. Is there anything you need? Anything I can bring you? James thought about the absurdity of the question. Everything they needed was gone, and yet here was this man, this stranger who was somehow not a stranger anymore, offering what help he could. No, thank you. My sister-in-law is taking us in until we figure things out. Michael nodded. If that changes or if you need anything at all, please don't hesitate to ask. We're neighbors after all. As he turned to leave, James called after him. Mr. Robinson. Michael paused at the door. Yes, sir. Thank you, truly. The young man smiled. You're welcome, Mr. Miller. Get some rest. After he left, James sat for a long time, thinking about the strange twists of fate that had brought them to this moment. If they hadn't gone to the cookout, would he have recognized Michael as their rescuer? Would Michael have known whose lives he was saving as he climbed that ladder? The next morning, both James and Margaret were discharged from the hospital. Melissa drove them to Aunt Susan's house in the suburbs, where they were given the guest room. Susan, Margaret's younger sister, fussed over them, providing comfortable clothes, toiletries, and other necessities to replace what they'd lost. The next few days passed in a blur of insurance calls, visits to the burned-out shell of their home to see what might be salvaged, very little, and appointments with doctors to monitor Margaret's recovery from the smoke inhalation. A week after the fire, they sat at Susan's dining room table discussing their options. The insurance will cover rebuilding, James said, reviewing the paperwork before him, but it would take months, and with Margaret's condition. We could rent something in the meantime, Melissa suggested, or buy a smaller place, something more manageable. Margaret, who had been quiet for most of the conversation, spoke up. I want to go home, James, not to a new place. Home. James reached for her hand. The house is gone, Margaret. But the neighborhood isn't. Our neighbors, our friends, they're still there. I don't want to start over somewhere else, not now. The unspoken thought hung in the air, not when time was already against them. We'll rebuild then, James decided. The insurance adjuster said it would take 6 to 8 months. We can find somewhere temporary until then. As they discussed the logistics, the doorbell rang. Susan went to answer it and returned a moment later with Michael and Tanya Robinson. Look who's here, Susan announced. They say they're your neighbors. James stood, surprised by the visit. Mr. Robinson, Mrs. Robinson, this is unexpected. Michael stepped forward, extending his hand. We don't mean to intrude, we just wanted to see how you were doing, and he glanced at Tanya, who nudged him encouragingly. Well, we have a proposition for you. Curious, James gestured for them to sit. Introductions were made all around, and Susan brought coffee and cookies. What kind of proposition? James asked once everyone was settled. Michael looked slightly nervous. We've been talking with some of the other neighbors. Everyone wants to help, but we weren't sure how. Then Mrs. Winters mentioned that you're planning to rebuild. James nodded. That's right, the insurance will cover most of it. The thing is, Michael continued, rebuilding takes time, and living in temporary housing can be. Well, less than ideal. Tanya picked up the thread. What Michael is trying to say is we have a finished basement apartment in our new house. It has a separate entrance, its own bathroom and kitchenette, even a small sitting area. It was one of the reasons we bought the place, thinking we might rent it out someday or use it for visiting family. We'd like to offer it to you, Michael said. While your house is being rebuilt, no rent, just help with utilities. You'd be right there in the neighborhood, able to watch the progress on your new home. James stared at them, speechless. It was the perfect solution, close to home, private yet not isolated, and far more comfortable than the extended-stay hotels they'd been considering. That's incredibly generous, Melissa said, filling the silence. But we couldn't possibly, please consider it, Tanya interrupted. It's sitting empty anyway. Frankly, with the baby coming, it would be a relief to have someone experienced nearby, first-time parents and all that. Margaret reached across the table and took Tanya's hand. That's very kind of you both. Could we perhaps see the apartment before deciding? Of course, Michael said quickly. Whenever you're ready, no pressure. James found his voice at last. Why would you do this for us? You barely know us. Michael met his gaze steadily. Because it's the right thing to do, because you're our neighbors. And because someday we might be the ones needing help. There was something in the young man's eyes, a sincerity, a fundamental decency that touched James deeply. This was the same man who had carried Margaret down that ladder, who had risked his life to save theirs without a second thought. We'll come see it tomorrow, James said. And thank you. The next day, Michael and Tanya showed them the basement apartment. It was smaller than their house, of course, but clean, bright, and thoughtfully furnished. A separate entrance at the back of the house led down a short flight of stairs to a living area with a comfortable sofa and television. Beyond that was a small but functional kitchenette, a bathroom with a walk-in shower, perfect for Margaret's increasingly unsteady balance, and a bedroom with a queen-sized bed and ample closet space. "It's lovely," Margaret declared, clearly charmed by the space. "James, don't you think?" James had to admit it was far better than he'd expected. It would certainly be convenient, being so close to the construction site. And familiar surroundings might be good for Mom, Melissa added quietly, referring to the Alzheimer's without naming it. "Well, think about it," Tanya said. "No rush to decide." But the decision had already been made. By the end of the week, James and Margaret had moved into the Robinsons' basement apartment with what few possessions they'd salvaged from the fire and new necessities purchased with the insurance money. Living in such close proximity to the young couple, James found his preconceptions challenged daily. Michael worked long shifts at the fire station, but always made time to help James with the rebuilding plans or to sit and talk about the neighborhood's history. Tanya, despite being in the late stages of pregnancy, brought down home-cooked meals and fresh flowers to brighten the apartment. Gradually, James found himself relaxing around them. The walls he'd built over decades of insulating himself in familiar surroundings began to crumble. He watched Margaret bloom in Tanya's company, the two women forming a bond that transcended age and background. When Margaret had bad days, moments of confusion or memory lapses, Tanya handled them with grace and understanding, never making her feel diminished. The baby arrived in late August, a boy they named Samuel James Robinson. When they brought him home from the hospital, Margaret was the first visitor allowed to hold him. "We named him after his grandfather and you, Mr. Miller," Michael explained as Margaret cradled the infant. "If that's okay." James, watching his wife's face light up as she gazed at the tiny bundle, felt something shift inside him. "It's an honor," he said, and meant it. As summer turned to fall, work began on rebuilding the Millers' house. James was there every day, overseeing the construction, making decisions about layouts and materials. The new house would be similar to the old one, but with modifications for Margaret's condition: wider doorways, a bedroom and bathroom on the first floor, safety features throughout. Michael often joined him during the planning sessions, offering practical suggestions from his experience as a firefighter about improved safety measures. The two men developed a routine of morning coffee in the basement apartment before heading over to the construction site together. One crisp October morning, as they sat at the small kitchen table reviewing the latest architectural drawings, Michael asked a question that caught James off guard. "Mr. Miller, can I ask you something personal?" James looked up from the blueprints. "I suppose." "That first day at our cookout, and even before that, when I came to invite you, I got the feeling you didn't want anything to do with us. Was it because we're black?" The directness of the question startled James. He considered deflecting, making excuses, but something in Michael's steady gaze demanded honesty. "Partly," he admitted. "I grew up in a different time, had certain ideas about how things should be, who belongs where." Michael nodded, his expression neutral. "And now?" James sighed, running a hand over his face. "Now I'm an old man who's lost almost everything but his wife and daughter, and I've been saved, literally and figuratively, by people I might have crossed the street to avoid a few months ago." He met Michael's eyes. "I was wrong, set in my ways, afraid of change, and yes, prejudiced. I'm not proud of it." "People can change," Michael said simply. "Even old ones." James chuckled despite himself. "Apparently so." They returned to the blueprints. The moment of tension passed, but something had shifted between them, a new honesty, a deeper respect. That evening, as James and Margaret prepared for bed in their temporary home, he told her about the conversation. "He just asked you outright?" Margaret seemed surprised. "That was brave of him." "It was," James agreed, "and he deserved an honest answer." Margaret sat on the edge of the bed, her reading glasses perched on her nose as she sorted through her medications. "You've changed, James, since the fire. For the better, I hope." She smiled at him, the same smile that had captured his heart all those years ago. "Definitely for the better. You're more open, less rigid. It suits you." James sat beside her, taking her hand. "I keep thinking about what might have happened if Michael hadn't been there that night, if he hadn't carried you down that ladder." "But he was, and he did," Margaret said firmly. "Sometimes the universe has to shake us up to help us see what really matters." James kissed her softly. "When did you get so wise?" "I've always been the wise one in this marriage," she teased. "You're just finally noticing." As they settled into bed, James thought about the strange path that had led them here, a fire that destroyed their home but somehow expanded their world, a neighbor he'd initially rejected becoming the person who saved what mattered most. Life had a way of teaching its hardest lessons through its greatest challenges. And sometimes, even an old man could learn new truths. The rebuilding progressed through the fall and into winter. By Christmas, the house had a roof and walls, though the interior was still far from complete. The Millers celebrated the holiday in the basement apartment, joined by Melissa, who flew in from Boston, and the Robinsons upstairs, who insisted on a combined Christmas dinner. As they gathered around the table in the Robinsons' dining room, baby Samuel sleeping peacefully in a bassinet nearby, James looked at the faces of their unlikely extended family. Melissa and Tanya chatting like old friends, Michael carving the turkey with the precision of a surgeon, Margaret, her eyes clear and present today, arranging the napkins just so, as she had for every holiday dinner of their marriage. "Before we eat," James said, rising to his feet and lifting his glass, "I'd like to say something." All eyes turned to him expectantly. This isn't the Christmas any of us imagined a year ago. Margaret and I certainly didn't expect to be living in a basement while our house is rebuilt. Michael and Tanya probably didn't plan to have two senior citizens as downstairs tenants with their new baby. This earned chuckles around the table. And yet here we are, and I, for one, am grateful. He looked at Michael. Grateful for neighbors who became friends. For the hands that pulled us from the fire, literally and figuratively. To Tanya, for the kindness that made a strange place feel like home. To Melissa, for the daughter who never gave up on her old-fashioned father even when he was stuck in his ways. And finally to Margaret, and most of all for my wife, who has always seen the best in people, even when I couldn't, who taught me that it's never too late to open your heart and your mind. He raised his glass higher. To family, the ones we're born with and the ones we find along the way. To family, they echoed, glasses clinking. As they ate and laughed and shared stories, James caught Michael watching him from across the table. The young man raised his glass in a private toast, a gesture of acknowledgement and respect. James returned the gesture, thinking of how far they'd both come since that first stilted conversation across the garden fence. How fortunate he was to have been given this second chance, not just at life, but at truly living it with eyes and heart open to possibilities he'd once rejected. Outside, snow began to fall, dusting the skeleton of the Millers' new house with white. By spring, it would be complete, and they would move back into their own home. But James knew that things would never return to the way they were before the fire. Margaret's condition would continue to progress, bringing new challenges each day. The neighborhood would keep changing, as neighborhoods always do. But now, instead of fearing these changes, James found himself curious about them, even eager for some. The rebuilt house would be filled with new memories, new traditions. The neighborhood would be richer for its diversity, for the blending of old and new. And he, in his final chapter, would be a different kind of man, one who understood that the strongest bonds are often forged in fire. As Margaret's laughter rang out at something Tanya had said, James smiled to himself. The universe had indeed shaken them up, just as Margaret had observed. And in the process, it had given them a gift he never knew he needed, the chance to see beyond the narrow confines of his prejudices to the humanity that connected them all. Now, back to where we started, on that fateful night when flames leaped through the windows of the Miller home. James stood frozen on his front lawn, watching in horror as the firefighter disappeared into the burning house to search for Margaret. Long seconds stretched into unbearable minutes. The structural integrity of the house was failing. A terrible groaning sound filled the air as beams began to give way. Just as the fire chief was calling his men to retreat, a figure emerged from the billowing smoke, the firefighter carrying Margaret's limp body in his arms. He staggered across the lawn, falling to his knees before the waiting paramedics. James rushed to his wife's side as oxygen was administered. Her eyes fluttered open and she coughed violently. "She's alive," a paramedic confirmed. James turned to thank the firefighter who had removed his helmet, revealing his face for the first time. The older man froze, his expression shifting from gratitude to recognition. The firefighter, a black man in his 30s with kind eyes, extended his hand. "Mr. Miller, are you all right?" James stared at the outstretched hand, then at the face of the man who had just saved his wife's life. Michael Robinson, his new neighbor, the man he'd been so reluctant to welcome. In that moment, all the barriers James had built over a lifetime, the prejudices, the fears, the resistance to change, crumbled like the burning house behind them. He grasped Michael's hand firmly in both of his own. "Yes," he said, his voice breaking with emotion. "Thanks to you, I think I'm going to be all right after all." And in that moment of connection, surrounded by the ruins of his old life, James Miller began to build something new, a life not bounded by fear and prejudice, but open to the full measure of human kindness and connection. A life where neighbors became family, where differences became strengths, and where even the oldest heart could learn new ways to love. If you're enjoying this story, please consider subscribing to hear more stories like this. Thank you for listening. If this story touched you, please subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments.